From internet use, keystrokes, and employee email to how often nurses wash their hands, almost every aspect of a worker's life can now be measured. For more on the rise of workplace monitoring, we're joined by Esther Kaplan. She is editor of the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute in New York, and we're very happy to have you here at TVO.
Thanks for having me.
We also have to say we've had your sister on this program a few times, so no pressure, but she was fantastic, just to let you know.
You're getting the bee hitter today.
Oh, no, on the contrary. I have high hopes for you. Here we go. Well, speaking of bee hitter, let's bring Moneyball into this, because, of course, Moneyball is the great example of how you could take something that's been around for 100 years, and by measuring different things and changing up the way you do analytics, suddenly a guy who might be a 275 hitter has a lot more value than you previously thought because there's different ways of measuring his contribution. Is a similar analytical revolution happening in the workplace?
It's definitely happening, and I think the hope is that it's going to turn out like Moneyball. I think a lot of enterprises are betting that it will turn out like Moneyball.
And that means
but we
what?
Don't know that yet.
If it turns out like
Moneyball? That it will
Moneyball?
unearth hidden talent. And for example, with recruitment, I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which analytics are being applied to identifying undervalued, say, engineers through their presence online. That you're going to, by the way they're acting online, you're going to identify someone that you can bring on that's currently being undervalued. That's a very Moneyball-like application in the business setting.
You have written about this. Every aspect of an office worker's life can now be measured. Every aspect. So what does that mean?
Well, we used to only be able to get information into computers that humans typed into computers. There was that phrase, garbage in, garbage out. Now we can pull in information from your vehicle. We can pull in information from the package you're delivering. We can pull in information from your keyboard, from your monitor. We can pull in information from basically every object that you interact with, in addition to information from you. So we've got oceans of data that we didn't used to have even a handful of years ago.
Is this a good thing?
We don't know yet. I don't think we know yet. There's a rush to adoption. There's tremendous speed at which telematics systems that are tracking vehicles and packages and everything are revolutionizing certainly how we receive packages, how we get deliveries, all of that kind of stuff. Scheduling systems that affect tens of millions of workers. It's all being recreated, rewritten as we speak, and I think there's a lot of unintended consequences.
Such as?
Well, let's take the drivers, delivery truck drivers. You're suddenly getting, as a supervisor, you're getting data on whether the seatbelt's buckled, on whether the rear door is open, on idling time, on...
Sorry, let me interrupt you. How do they know all this?
There's 200 sensors on any UPS vehicle.
That can tell you whether the driver's seatbelt is done up.
Oh yeah, can tell. And then there's a handheld device which is delivering another ream of data. So you've got tremendous amounts of data coming in, and the question is, how are you as a company, how are you as a direct supervisor, how are you deciding which pieces of that data are important and what are you doing with it?
Do the drivers know that they're being monitored this significantly?
They do, but they don't have to legally be aware that they're being monitored. And none of us have the right in the United States, or very few of us in the United States and Canada, to know if we're being monitored in the workplace.
Having said that, here are some numbers from UPS. In the years that they call telematics, Telematics. In the years that telematics is being rolled out, this is between 2009 and 2013, deliveries by UPS increased 1.4 million pieces, but they were delivered by 1,000 fewer drivers. So that sounds like, if you're the company, a productivity increase. That's fantastic. Would you agree?
Yeah, they're delivering a lot more packages with fewer drivers. They're also getting at least some modest fuel savings, maybe a few $100,000 a year in fuel savings. The question is, what is the cost, or one of the questions, the question I'm pretty interested in is, what is the cost to those drivers?
Cost in what?
Blown out shoulders, blown out knees, stress. There's a lot of data showing that if you're doing a complex task under monitoring, not just keyboard inputting or answering the phone, but if you're doing something complex that involves decision making, like driving in traffic, would be a perfect example, and you're aware that you're being monitored, there's a whole piece of your brain that's busy being distracted by that. So you're now applying a lot less attention to the job at hand. It risks more accidents. The time pressures have become so enormous on the drivers that they're doing shortcuts, they're not lifting safely, they're constantly jaywalking across busy traffic to deliver packages because they can't afford that extra 20 seconds or half a minute to get to the corner and cross at the light. They're just buckling their seatbelts, many of them, behind them so that their seatbelt metric looks good, rather than take that extra moment each stop to buckle and unbuckle. So you see all of these unintended consequences once you start measuring people in that granular level of detail.
All towards presumably a much more, well, an obsession with productivity, I guess. Is that what it's about?
Right, yeah.
How about in an office? I get, okay, truckers out on the road. How about in an office? How and what would you monitor people doing in a similar fashion in an office setting?
Well, first of all, you don't even have to be in your office anymore. If you're taking the company computer home, it's the exact same amount of surveillance. So, I mean, everything, number of keystrokes, number of mouse clicks, every website you visit, every email you send. It's possible to map every electronic relationship you have in the business setting. So how many different people I email, if I'm posting on their page, if someone's viewing a PowerPoint or slide deck that I created, all of these connections and communications can be tracked and mapped so that they know both the social map in which I'm existing day in and day out, and then also, if they want, the content of every web search, of every email send. It's all available, and there are no laws prohibiting them from observing that, tracking that, evaluating you on that basis.
Let's follow up on that. You hired a freelancer, didn't you, to check out your computer? Okay, what happened there?
Right. So there are a number of freelance marketplaces now, Elance, Odesk, that allow individuals and companies to hire people in this burgeoning freelance gig economy that we're now in. And so one of them, well, Elance and Odesk are now a merged company, but they're the leader in the field. They offer this guarantee that if I'm a freelance graphic designer or transcriber or whatever, I am guaranteed payment from some client I've never met in Australia or wherever if I participate in their electronic work diary. And what that allows is, if you, here in Toronto, were to hire me in Brooklyn to do a freelance job, you could peek in at my computer every 10 minutes. There would be a snapshot of everything on my computer screen, which you'd be able to look at, and you'd be able to see exactly how many keystrokes and mouse clicks and so on happened on a minute-by-minute basis, and you'd be able to see the work unfurl in real time.
What's the concern there?
Well, there's a number of concerns. One is that's a little creepy. When I hired a transcriber to do some transcriptions for me, and it was a little spooky to be able to, she was in Texas, for me to be able to open my laptop, in bed at night and peek in on hers, someone I'd never met.
Because there's an assumption that you're in a private setting, presumably.
Yeah.
So that notion of privacy is gone.
I could see her screensaver. I could see a list of her other clients. I mean, in and of itself, there was a very big brotherly feeling to it. But then when I interviewed her afterward, it was also clear there were other problems, which is her productivity is measured in 10-minute increments. So every time she would start up, she would just erase the first 10-minute increment because it would actually only be 8 minutes or 7 minutes, and she didn't want her productivity rating, which shows up on the marketplace, to look bad. So she just cut out that many minutes of pay every time she started. And then when she finished a transcription and was proofreading it on the screen, she wouldn't have very many keystrokes. So again, her activity meter would look low. So for every hour she transcribed, which between transcribing and proofreading would take her 5.5 hours, she was only really getting paid for 4.
So she cheated herself to look more productive.
Right. So we have pressure coming directly from employers that's exacerbated by this kind of monitoring, and then the pressure that freelancers put on themselves. Once the metrics are there, people know they have to hit those marks. And so we see in various kinds of ways wage theft happening. In this case, it's sort of voluntary, I guess. In other cases, it's involuntary in fast food and retail and other areas.
Let's pick up on that, because we've talked trucking, we've talked computers. Let's talk the world of fast food. What's Chronos? K-R-O-N-O-S.
Chronos, the god of time.
God of precarious work.
Right, now it already is now the god of precarious labor. I mean, there's been this tremendous change in retail and fast food over the decades. There used to be much more of an emphasis, particularly in retail, on service. Now it's really about that lean labor cost. I mean, that's the whole business model. So in fast food in particular, the profit margins are so slim. So that's the only place they can go to trim costs is putting pressure on labor. So when systems like Chronos, and they're just one of the leading third-party providers of these systems, or these scheduling systems that scoop in all this historical data, it's very Moneyball, right? So you have sales at this point last year, sales when the Blue Jays are playing, or when they win, or when they lose, and we know, and then it rains, and it's sunny, and we just have all this data to tell us in very granular predictive detail what your revenue is going to look like for that day. And you're given a labor mark. But then even within the course of that day, in 10 or 15-minute increments, you're watching as your ratio between revenue and labor costs rises and falls. And there's so much pressure on the shift managers that the minute their labor number gets too high, they basically will clock people out. Like this, there's a class action suit about this against McDonald's right now. Clock people out, tell them to go sit in the break room. They can't leave. They can't go live their lives. Wait until that labor number drops again, we'll clock you back in. Or we'll clock you out, but then actually you have to finish up 40 minutes worth of tasks before you can actually go home. Or you arrive and we say, there's not enough business to clock you in yet, but can you go ahead and prep this area or restock the napkins or whatever. So you're actually working for half an hour before you clock in. I talked to one former shift manager who said at any given moment, half the employees in her McDonald's would be off the clock.
And therefore not getting paid?
But working, yes, not getting paid.
Off the clock, working, not getting paid.
Yeah, meanwhile, probably paying the babysitter at home to watch the kids. But so 10, 11, 12 hours of work uncompensated in a given week.
Part of, if I understand this properly, part of the goal, though, behind doing all of that is to prevent the employees from ripping you off. Isn't that part of their motive?
Well, some of the Chronos systems are designed for that, where you actually have to do a thumb scan or finger scan for clocking in, because they advertise that, that this is a way to prevent time theft by your employees, so that their buddy can't clock them in when they're running 10 minutes late.
Right.
That's in theory what they're trying to prevent. They're also trying to structure your schedules so that you get the leanest possible labor costs. But the problem is, and we see this in other sectors, with the advent of standardized tests in education, we see teachers teaching to the test. Mm-hmm. Once you set these metrics, people shift the game to try to meet them, and at that point, they might start cutting corners. In the case of McDonald's and I think other fast food places, they're cutting corners to the point of violating wage and hour laws in a widespread way.
I don't know if you know Ann Cavoukian, but she used to be Ontario's Information and Privacy Commissioner. She's a person who is a total stickler for privacy, and it was her job for I think about 10 years to tell the government to keep its nose out of people's business. She's now the executive director of Ryerson's Privacy and Big Data Institute, Ryerson University here in Toronto. Here's what she says. She has some sympathy for business on this one. She says, you're there to work, you're being paid. And if it's made very clear to you that we monitor your emails, then the employee has the choice whether they want to work in a workplace like that. I think it's unreasonable to think that workplaces and employers are not going to use every means available to increase efficiency and productivity. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that's a very North American attitude. And in Europe, there are actually quite strict laws for member states to, if you're going to monitor and collect data about your employees, they have to be notified that you're doing it. They have to understand the scope of what you're collecting, and they have to express to you the purpose for which they're collecting the data.
And we don't have that here.
No.
You'd like to see that here,
So
presumably.
I think personally employees have the right. I think we've had a robust debate about government surveillance in recent years, and even we're starting to have a robust debate about the collection of consumer data. But somehow we think that in the workplace realm, we've relinquished all our rights when we walk in the door to collect that paycheck. And I think that's maybe an area that needs some debate too.
If we're worshiping, though, at the God of increased productivity, can you tell whether or not this increased workplace surveillance is in fact making people more productive?
There's absolutely data in certain settings that it is. It's certainly can help trucking fleets and transportation fleets with fuel efficiency. There's seems to be indications it can prevent theft in the kind of restaurant and retail setting. In other areas, it's less clear. I mean, there are retailers like Costco is one of the examples, or Trader Joe's. I'm not sure if those chains are here, that have taken a totally other model, which is stable workforce, full-time workforce, not this last-minute scheduling to only schedule workers part-time for peak spots, but really create a committed and dedicated customer service-oriented workforce. And they've got actually higher revenue per dollar spent on labor than these firms that are taking the leaner approach. So it's certainly not the only path to profits.
I'm going to play devil's advocate with you here a bit. I'm trying to see if there's a positive side to some of this stuff. And how about this as a for instance? You got a boss who's maybe a bit of a sexist or a bit of a racist, and whenever it comes time to promoting people or giving the best shifts to people, it's always the guys and not the women who are getting it, or it's always the white people and not the black people or the Hispanics or the Asians who are getting it. But now we've got these new metrics, and now we can, with a great deal of definitiveness, tell who our best and most productive employees are, and therefore it's harder to be discriminatory as a boss when you may have analytics showing, actually it's the woman who's more productive than the man, or it's the black guy who's more productive than the white guy.
Right.
Is that a possible upside to this?
Absolutely. I think there's actually many possible upsides. I think the fuel savings and vehicle maintenance, buying fewer vehicles, using less fuel, I think there are certain areas that are absolutely positive. There's no question. And I think for the hiring and promotion, that's possible. There's also indications, though, that sometimes these metrics become proxies, unintentional proxies for things, and promote discrimination. There's a firm that's being sued out in California because the way their data worked, it was discriminating in hiring against people with disabilities. It turned out it was possibly discriminating against African Americans because it had developed commute time as a metric for worker retention, and that turned out to discriminate against people in more distant, more affordable neighborhoods. There are ways in which when you start tracking people's networking and social networking in the enterprise setting, that sometimes you're rewarding people that were sort of born with more robust social networks above people who were not born with such robust networks, which becomes a proxy for wealth and for race. So you have to be very careful that the metrics are actually meritocratic, and they can appear to be, and then it can turn out when you look more closely at what you're measuring that you're actually reinforcing bias rather than busting it open. So
It's like relationships, Esther, isn't it? It's complicated.
it's complicated.
It's complicated. Well, we're really glad that you could make the trip up from Brooklyn, New York to share some of your views with us today on this. Esther Kaplan, editor of the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.